and get started. So welcome again. My name is Josh Goldstein. I'm with the Nature Conservancy, a global conservation organization, and I'll be the moderator for today's session titled Conservation in Wash Systems, Collaborating on Source Water Protection. This session is fundamentally about inspiring deeper and more actionable connections between environmental conservation and WASH actors, aiming to build a more resilient, water-secure future. And we know the challenges all of us all too well. 5 years into work on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we are way off track to achieve universal WASH access by 2030. As of last year, 2 billion people lacked access to safe drinking water services, and 3.6 billion lacked access to safely managed sanitation services. And according to the most recent JUMP report, we need to move 4 times faster if we're going to close that gap by 2030. And the story from the conservation side is no less concerning. Amidst the backdrop of widespread declines in biodiversity around the world, freshwater systems, so rivers, lakes, wetlands, are showing particularly high rates of decline. According to the WWF Living Planet report, populations of freshwater species have declined 84% since 1970. And that's a rate that's higher than being seen in oceans or in forests. These challenges to WASH and to conservation, they're often talked about and addressed separately from each other, but they are not separate, and they are and have always been tightly linked. For too many decades, the WASH and conservation sectors have acted on their own, but we can't solve our problems apart from each other. Doing so risks making gains for one sector at the expense of the other. We miss building broader constituencies to support our work and to more efficiently target funds for shared impact. And the growing impacts of climate change are shining a harsh light on weaknesses in siloed solutions for conservation or for WASH. We just simply need to do better. And there's a ton of bright spots all around the world where we are learning what that means to do better, and that can help us build a more resilient and water secure future. Today's session, we bring together people who wake up each and every day thinking about these issues and the question, how can we achieve more together by delivering integrated solutions addressing conservation and WASH? So I'm grateful to our panelists for joining us today to share their experiences. And they're going to be sharing the really inspiring parts and also the really hard parts with us about what it takes to drive the progress needed. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel today. Our first panelist is Alexandra Campbell Ferrari. She is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Water Security and Cooperation. She is also a professor of water law at the University of Maryland and the American University. Second, we have Kate Harawa. Kate is the director of Influence and Scale for the nonprofit Water for People. She brings over 20 years of experience as a WASH specialist, and particularly in connecting WASH with water resources management. Third, we have Dr. Basil Mahaney. And Basil is the deputy director of the USAID Sustainable Water Partnership through Tetra Tech. He's been the technical activity manager for the Sustainable Water Partnership's pilot work in the Mara Basin in Kenya and Tanzania. He's also leading that partnership's thought leadership work. Finally, we have Eric Oyare. Eric is the WWF Blue Heart of Africa Initiative lead. In this role, Eric is responsible for providing freshwater technical program development, business development, advocacy, and communication support to 10 country offices and 7 transboundary landscapes where WWF implements water resources management throughout Africa. Appreciate all the panel joining us today and sharing their experiences. Our conversation is going to follow the following format. We're going to have a conversation amongst the panel, and we're going to touch on 4 areas together. The first will be each panelist sharing their perspective that they are bringing to today's conversation about how to bring conservation and WASH together, particularly around source water protection. Second, they're going to be sharing their reflections on what the key barriers they see in the field that make it really difficult to make these connections between conservation and WASH. Third, discussing what they see as entry points for overcoming these barriers. And then fourth and final, to be talking about what it takes to catalyze meaningful collaboration at the pace and scale needed to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 6 and achieve the outcomes we all seek together. We're going to leave space for good engagement with the audience for questions and answers. So encourage you to submit questions through Zoom or through Pathable and do that at any time. We'll be monitoring the chats on both sites and be able to bring in your questions in the second part of the session today. Finally, we're going to end with giving each panelist a chance to make a call to action before we go ahead and wrap. The last thing I'll note is just a reminder that the session today is being recorded. So with that, let's go ahead and transition into our panel discussion. I want to start today's session by inviting each participant to begin by describing the perspective they are bringing to today's conversation around integrating conservation and WASH. And after that, give them a chance to talk about what they see as the barriers. So we know that collaboration is essential. It's also quite challenging. And so we want them to think specifically about the context in which they're working and what the real barriers are that they see in the field that need to be overcome to develop more resilient systems for nature and people. I'm going to ask Eric to go ahead and start us off with his answer to this question. So over to you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Josh, and hello to our audience. It's really a pleasure joining this conversation, which is, of course, going to focus us on conservation in WASH systems. In terms of WWF and especially Blue Heart of Africa's perspective on this agenda and topic, the origin of this is the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, which, of course, all of us know that it has had huge impacts on our communities and economies across the world. But it has also changed the relationship we are having with the natural world. We've gained a better understanding of the connection between water, health, and the economy more than before. And many more of us can now clearly see the deeper link between human health and landscape health. There is no doubt that water and sanitation provision and food security interventions within Africa and even the rest of the world for most of the vulnerable communities living in very deplorable conditions need to address the nexus between freshwater and ecosystem services management upon which WASH provision depend on. From WWF, our conservation mission and mission forms an important component of our One Health agenda and approach, which looks at ensuring that the delivery of water and sanitation services is made possible. To that end, on this year's World Water Day, which happened on the 22nd of March 2021, WWF, through Blue Heart of Africa initiative, signed agreements with 4 WASH leading organizations in the world to look at how we can ensure that we achieve the One Health agenda outcomes. These organizations include water.org, they include IRC WASH, they include WaterAid, and finally CARE. And out of that agreement that we've signed, we have developed an operational framework with these institutions, which is going to collaborate, which is going to mobilize our expertise, and we are going to unite our leadership across the board to ensure that we develop and we co-develop comprehensive strategies and programs in our selected countries in Africa and the transboundary landscapes that we are working on to ensure that we make it very clear the symbiotic relationship between human health and WASH. We want to ensure that we also are able to bring together other organizations, including private sector and governments, through advocacy to ensure that that nexus between ensuring that everybody understands that water does not come from the tap is made real, and everybody can push that agenda forward. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Eric, and great reflections, I think, to start with placing us in the pandemic and the importance of the moment we have now. And I think ending with really our critical need to connect from source to tap as we think about these systems going forward. So thanks for getting us started, Eric. I'm going to pass over next to Kate for her chance to share the perspective she's bringing to this conversation and what Kate, you see as some of the key barriers to advancing the collaboration needed. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Josh. So the perspective that I bring as a Water for People employee is from Blantyre, where we're actually working, and we've been working for the past 14 years or so. Blantyre is in Malawi and is the commercial city and also the industrial hub for Malawi. As such, it's a quite busy city. However, over the years, Blantyre has faced multiple challenges in sustainable water supplies due to varying factors across dry and wet seasons. As such, Water for People, Blantyre Water Board, which is a utility company in Malawi, as well as the nature conservers have come together to pursue an integrated approach to linking source water management and waste service delivery. Because we all know that we need each other to make sure that indeed Blantyre has sustainable access to water. So challenges are there in terms of collaboration or working together, people of different backgrounds, especially WASH specialists and the conservationists. However, when you look at these challenges, overall, they are minor compared to the comparing option to address the bigger problem that we all face. So I'll still highlight some of the challenges that we've noted. Mostly they are with regard to finding common terminologies and understanding the challenges, since we specialize in different areas, as well as working across organizations. So as you come together, we have different planning schedules, we have different budgeting cycles. So, and to come together and agree and move at the same pace is not easy, but still it's something that can be done. So influencing the pace of work, you really need to understand each other and take into consideration other people's schedules. The other barrier is that this water fund that we are working on in Blantyre, the Blantyre Water Fund, or the source water protection for Blantyre, it's the first one. It's the first of its kind. So we are learning through it and agreeing upon the best data sources and how to use the data by all partners also has been challenging. The other thing for us also, it's also about political landscape shifting, which makes it sometimes difficult to establish and maintain relationships. So as maybe governments change, staff change, or people in organizations change, maintaining those relationships and the momentum in terms of what to discuss, how to move on can also be challenging. So I think for now, in terms of barriers, I would stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate. And I think really important barriers to be getting out into the discussion today. Also want to appreciate your comment you made about recognizing that the barriers are real, but when we think about the opportunity in front of us for better impact through collaboration, to really be led by that and see that compelling opportunity as a primary driver of working together across sectors. Thanks, Kate. Basel, I want to turn to you next. Again, invite your perspective you're bringing from the work on the Sustainable Water Partnership, and what are the key barriers that you see out in the field that need to be addressed?
Sure. Thanks, Josh, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this panel. I've really enjoyed learning from the others and hearing about the great work that's taking place. Very briefly about the Sustainable Water Partnership. We're a USAID-funded water security program, and under SWP, we piloted a stakeholder-driven water security improvement process in the Mara Basin and in the Stung Chinit Basin in Cambodia. And I'll be focusing on our work in the Mara. Rural communities in the Mara Basin, where more than 1 million people reside across Kenya and Tanzania, depend on multiple sources of water for drinking and domestic needs, as well as their livelihoods. The Mara Basin, of course, also contains key tourist and conservation areas, such as the Masai Mara National Reserve and the Serengeti National Park. and access to water for many communities in the Mara Basin is a challenge. Now, in Kenya and Tanzania, we worked with basin managers and WASH stakeholders and communities to improve water resources management, strengthen planning systems, and support catchment conservation efforts. And among our activities, we worked with local stakeholders to protect freshwater springs. Over time, habitat loss and mixed uses such as on-site washing and livestock watering and agriculture have exposed these springs to water quality risks, and extreme flooding caused by more irregular and intense precipitation from climate change inundate the springs and also increase the risk of contamination. And this creates significant health risks to the communities who depend on the springs for drinking water, particularly in the dry season. Green and gray infrastructure can limit the potential harm to the springs surrounding the habitat caused by humans and livestock, and reduce the risk of contamination from runoff. Protection measures can also improve water quality and reduce public health risks from drinking contaminated water, and ensuring that water is sufficient for different uses, especially for agricultural and livelihood needs. Now, we approached this through a water security lens. And what this means is we focused on, of course, safeguarding the availability of, access to, and safe use of adequate, reliable, and resilient quantity and quality of water for health, livelihoods, and ecosystems. And our water security improvement process emphasizes local leadership and collaboration among different types of stakeholders and water users. And the process is intended to be iterative, such that assessments of water security risks, planning processes, and water security improvement measures are regularly evaluated and adapted as lessons learned and conditions are changed. And within our WSI process in the Mara, we approached WASH conservation and source water protection with 3 points in mind. And that's engaging the right stakeholders through clear and targeted activities to scale water security improvements. Now, with regards to the barriers, I mean, there are two main barriers that sort of stand out for me from our experience in the Mara. And the first is that basin and WASH managers often have very distinct mandates and operate in siloed institutions. And while they're clearly connected through water availability and water quality issues, there's often limited engagement between the two. And one of the reasons, among many, is that there are, both sets of stakeholders struggle with understaffing, capacity constraints, and low funding, which can limit or impede the ability of basin managers and service providers to fulfill their own mandates, let alone being able to come together to coordinate or collaborate on source water protection. Obviously, these challenges are inherently related. It's hard to collaborate when you don't have the right resources available to do so. And so being able to connect source water protection and WASH in meaningful ways requires that we address how basin managers and WASH providers are able to work outside of their institutional lanes and overcome these critical resource constraints. And to illustrate this, just to quickly sort of draw out the example from Cambodia, from Tanzania, to give a little more context. By focusing on freshwater springs, we were very much site-based. We didn't have to worry about upstream or downstream dynamics. All of the uses and all of the abstractions were taking place at one location. And we had a number of different institutions and entities that we had to work with. At the community level, you had water user associations, or on the water resources side, and village water committees, and in some cases, community-based water supply organizations, which are managing sort of the WASH space and service delivery space at the springs. At a broader, more basin level or regional level, we have the Lake Victoria Basin Water Board, which is responsible for water resources management within the broader Mara Basin, responsible for water abstraction, ambient water quality, permitting, things like that. And then for the WASH side, the newly created National Rural Water and Sanitation Agency, which provides technical assistance and guidance to the village water committees and community-based water supply organizations in the operations and maintenance of WASH infrastructure. So what we had to do was figure out how we bring all of these stakeholders together in clear and actionable ways to facilitate sustainable source water protection, spring protection for these local communities in light of these barriers to collaboration. Thanks.
Thanks for those comments, Basil. And I think a great reminder about how interconnected all these barriers are. We can list them individually, but they are fundamentally connected to each other. I want to pass now over to Alexandra. You'll get the last word on this topic, but I think you bring a really important and complementary perspective to the ones we've heard so far. So again, welcome your perspective and the barriers that you are seeing. So over to you.
Great, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are. As Josh said, my name is Alexandra, and I run the Center for Water Security and Cooperation. We're a small nonprofit that was started about 5 years ago, in large part because we saw two things missing from the water sector writ large. One is that there was really a lack of clear vision. So water security is slowly kind of becoming that vision, but even so, we all define water security differently. It means something different to us, and it hasn't quite taken the hold that it needs to really drive the work that we're all doing. And the second part of that is that the law, for myself and my colleague, we're both, lawyers, and for us, underpinning all of this work in water is the law. So for us, in terms of actually seeing a lasting success in all the work that we're doing, we don't think that we will see that lasting success without that strong legal foundation. And what that means is that the people that have water and have access to water today will either lose that over time, and the people that don't have it today will not ever get it without that law being in place. A lot of the work that we do and the perspective that we bring focuses on that legal perspective, but really starting from a place that in large part the laws are either not in place, they're very hidden, or they're not really practiced. And so there's a lot of countries that have water laws in place. They may not be, they're oftentimes weak, which really presents an opportunity to strengthen them, to show that commitment to protecting water quality, to guaranteeing access to water and sanitation. In large part, creating those processes that need to be in place to ensure good water quality, to ensure that our access to water resources is sustainable, and to creating those institutions. So I'm sure the word institution is going to come up a lot today, but creating those clear mandates for these institutions, whether it be a river basin organization, a ministry, a local government, and those inner working groups that have been created as well. Mandates and knowing what you have to do are clear, and those are all set forth in the law. Even the process itself, we talk a lot about citizen participation, public participation, and we want that. We want to seek out that engagement, right? These laws should represent who you are and what you want from your community. But oftentimes the law don't create that system. They don't create that process. And so the law sets all of this up. It sets these guardrails, it sets this foundation. And that's what we need to be focusing on in order to ensure that we think about source water protection in the same vein as WASH. I will add a caveat to that, is that oftentimes there are laws that might be working against us. And so that's also, it doesn't mean that you throw out law and you see that that's not a good mechanism. What it means is that we have a lot of work ahead of us. And a lot of countries, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, we all have a lot of work before us. And so that's where we focus on. And we believe that with that strong legal foundation, we'll be able to achieve a lot of these goals and finally make that connection between protecting our source waters and ensuring access to water and sanitation. As a last point, in terms of barriers, one of the biggest barriers that we see is access to information. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but it's really that the laws are often not available, so you can't get access to them, or they're not accessible, right? Laws can be very long, oftentimes they're very difficult to understand. And so one of the things that we're working on is creating a platform called Renewal. We soft launched it. It is available online, so you can take a look at it. It's available for 3 countries right now, for Kenya, Nigeria, and Sudan. And the idea behind it is that in order for law to be meaningful for us, we have to know what it is. And even more so, we have to know what it means across all these different silos and nexuses that form that relationship to water. So we have conducted a comprehensive analysis on all the laws that influence and govern water across our 10 nexuses. So we look at agriculture, drinking water, sanitation, health and hygiene, the global economy, national security, governance and institutions, energy, infrastructure, natural resources and services, disasters. We look at all of these different nexuses and all of these laws, and we provide a very clear description of, well, how is the law governing that nexus to water? What are we doing? And we're in the process of actually creating a benchmark that will help us to show well, where should we be, right? Like, what does this actually look like? And how do we get there? So I would say that for us is really the biggest barrier. We need to have that access to data and information. And we do that in other sectors, but not really, we don't really do a great job of that in the legal sector.
Thanks, Alexandra. Critical perspective to bring into this conversation on laws and legal institutions, both recognizing how they may create barriers that we have to overcome, but also how essential they are. Laws, data, information, all this to creating durable, inclusive solutions. And I appreciate the perspective here. I think we've gotten out some great conversation here. Eric, I know you want to add just a bit more perspective on challenges. So pass to you for a quick minute more here, and then we'll move on to the next part of the conversation. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Josh. I think the rest of the panel has really done a good job in terms of focusing on beyond the perspective, the challenges that we are facing. For WWF, and especially within the African continent, the countries where we're working, of course, I'll also echo, especially for instance, what Basil has noted in terms of a highly disjointed water resource management, WASH sectors, in terms of the actors, the players in these two sectors. Be it government-aligned ministries, be it private sector, be it civil society, and even at basin level, the associations, the water resource users that we form are not really integrated in terms of the holistic view of addressing source water management and ensuring that that is what informs effective and sustainable water and sanitation service delivery. Again, second to that, what we've also faced is in terms of urban planning, population growth, and especially urbanization in most of the African cities. That population growth is affecting and even actions by private sector in terms of manufacturing. There is a lot of waste disposal and effluent discharge into our water resources and our water sources. And that, of course, has an impact in terms of wash at the end of the day, because it's the same water, especially surface water sources that we rely on to deliver wash. Thirdly is, of course, climate change, and looking at, of course, the impacts of climate change in terms of how that affects source water ecosystems, how it affects human habitat, looking at aspects of flooding, looking at aspects of drought, and all these are related in terms of water security, how that affects even in terms of infrastructure, the green infrastructure, for instance, wetlands that we have, the impact of climate change destroying that. And finally is looking across the board, the model of payment for ecosystem services. In a number of the country offices that we are working, this has not become a national framework, a national discourse where we are looking at how do we work with upstream communities, how do we address players at the downstream who abstract water from the water sources, and how do we effectively ensure that our conservation related work addresses issues of siltation, addresses issues of pollution and such kind of stuff. I'll hand it back to you, Josh, but I think it's a very rich conversation going forward.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to each of the panelists for getting us started here, helping understand the barriers that we see. And they're diverse, they're connected, they're hard, right? From lack of data and information, different mandates between basins and WASH authorities, challenges in terms of terminology, how our organizations work, and so on. Many things to overcome. And in this conversation, we see it is really important, and why we've brought each of the panelists is because each of the panelists here, and I imagine many of you in the audience, are involved in ways, pioneering efforts to overcome these barriers. And as we look to increase the pace and scale of this work, we're really curious to understand, what are the entry points for overcoming these barriers? And I'd like to go ahead and turn to the panel next to ask this question about entry points. What are the entry points that you are seeing in the various places you're working that are giving us a line of sight to what solutions can be to get at the scale needed for change here? Before I do that, just a quick reminder, first a thanks to Wesley, who's put in the first question in the chat, Unpathable. Welcome others to add questions, comments, make this an interactive discussion. But as we think about entry points, I'll actually pass back to Alexandra. Would you like to get us started on this question?
Sure. So I think there's a few entry points. One is that, we need to think about, at least from the legal perspective, how are your laws setting you up to even think about this connection, right? So here's one example. If we're trying to think about drinking water and the link to source water protection, the link is actually quite clear, right? Our drinking water comes from our source water. So the dirtier and more contaminated and more polluted our source water is, the harder it is to actually have access to safe drinking water. One of the, at least, and I'll say from the United States, because this is very present in my mind, is that agriculture is not regulated under our Clean Water Act. And so all that fertilizer can run off, and it makes it a lot harder, all the nitrates. And so drinking water facilities are more and more having greater challenges in actually meeting the nitrate maximum contaminant levels under our Safe Drinking Water Act, because the source waters have so much nitrates. And so what that does is that increases the cost of providing drinking water, which then means that lower income households are going to get a larger and larger bill over the years, which they can't pay. And then they can't pay for water, they experience water shutoffs, and so on and so forth. So that's one link on the drinking water side. From the sanitation side, when you think about the link between source water protection, it's the opposite, right? So wastewater, if we're not treating our wastewater, if we don't have proper sanitation services in place, which we have to think about non-sewer sanitation, right? Wastewater treatment plants are not necessarily the best option. And this is something, again, I point to the US because these are conversations we're actually currently having here, but they're not necessarily the best option. And so non-sewer sanitation is critical in this conversation, because if we can ensure that our sanitation is properly contained, it won't contaminate the source waters, which means that if the source waters are less contaminated, yet again, we have a better chance of actually providing safe drinking water. Also, for non-sewer sanitation, some of the challenges come with the laws not providing any guidance for non-sewer sanitation, right? So there aren't strict guidelines of, okay, if you're going to have a well, you need to have a specific distance between the well and your pit latrine. And so without those clear guidelines that come forth in a regulation, but which are directed by the law, which the law says you must create regulations that govern this distance, that govern non-sewer sanitation, we're not going to be able to make that change. I will say one example from some field work that we were doing in India, the Swachh Bharat movement, right? Just a tremendous success in terms of finally getting people access to sanitation. Some of the challenges is that the kinds of the types of non-sewer sanitation that were installed weren't regulated. And so what happened is that rather than the dual pit latrines being put in, single pit latrines were put in, which means that they have to be emptied, which means that there has to be a facility to treat them. And that was not necessarily envisioned or considered when this movement was started. And so while today there's been a tremendous success in that and increasing exponentially the access to to sanitation writ large, in several years, there's going to be a larger issue when those pit latrines are filled. And this is the kind of role that law plays. It helps to create that vision, right? That direction, that guidebook. And it also creates limitations, right? It says, okay, you can't do some of these things, or here are things that you have to consider, or here are things that you may consider, right? There's some things that, aren't necessarily as important, but it sets that framework, which is so critical for guiding these movements, for creating that direction that's so critical for actually seeing success and making those links between source water protection and greater access to water and sanitation.
Thanks, Alexandra. So law is a critical foundation to get solutions that are actually going to work, be able to be supported by local stakeholders, funded and durable over time. Thanks for those comments. Basil, I'll pass over to you to continue.
Sure, thanks. Alexandra, your points are I think really important. And as I think about it in the context of our work in the MARA, I think sort of the local regulations. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, so I haven't analyzed it from the legal gaps. But in terms of, there's also this sort of parallel challenge is even when sort of those rules and roles and responsibilities are laid out, the next step is getting to the implementation and fulfillment of those roles and responsibilities. And how do we bring these stakeholders together given the daunting challenges they face, Basin-wide, to focus on these these handful of springs. And so for SWP, to get to it, we really sort of focused on two sort of complementary approaches. One is facilitating pragmatic actions and for tangible opportunities around collaboration between the basin and the WASH managers, as well as sustained engagement with some of the key stakeholders to help sort of facilitate the process throughout. So the spring protection process that we helped support involved a number of steps, and that included, preliminary community engagement to identify and prioritize among the springs, site assessments to understand the sources of degradation and water use practices, focus group discussions to understand community priorities and water security needs, and finally, the actual implementation of the site improvements using green and gray infrastructure, particularly for the gray infrastructure for the water and the drinking water infrastructure, the spring boxes and the taps, as well as installation of some livestock troughs and washing bays. And within these steps, we really tried to focus on specific opportunities for the basin and the WASH managers. And I'm talking specifically around the Basin Water Board and RWASA to work together. And some of the tangible examples I can point to are, conducting joint site inspections, as well as design and planning sessions. And these coordinated efforts were necessary to ensure that the environmental conditions of the spring, the multiple uses of the spring, as well as WASH needs, were considered in tandem together. And to ensure that the spring protection effort was also compliant with national standards, that we weren't setting something up that was going to undermine drinking water quality and ultimately affect communities. In parallel, we maintained sustained engagement with the Water User Association. So they were really important partners for us when working in the Mara Basin, because they were sort of the conduit. They facilitated sort of the access and the liaison. They served as liaisons to the communities and helped us sort of define the source water protection priorities and facilitate that community engagement. And, as part of the community investment in this process, the Water User Associations helped mobilize community members to support some of the construction and site rehabilitation. One thing I think that is also important to note, especially in terms of resourcing constraints, is one of the challenges. SWP as a project, as a donor-funded project, played a really important role in providing catalytic resources to making sure that there were funds available for the construction materials and sort of the other sort of resources needed for the site rehabilitation. And I think this is a challenge that we, us in this space, continue to talk about. How do we design and work around these projects to deliver sort of sustainable outcomes and sustainable solutions, so that the donor funding is not a critical example or a critical resource for making this happen. And I think in the case of SWP, that those funds were necessary to help make the spring protection a reality. But I think what was really important there is sort of demonstrating that this is how it can become possible. This is how these basin and WASH stakeholders can come together sort of and overcome the constraints that they face on their time and their responsibilities to work together towards these overall broader goals for source water protection and WASH. Thanks.
Thanks, Basil. Kate, I'll pass over to you for your perspective on entry points for overcoming the barriers you see in the field.
Thank you very much, Josh. For us, in terms of overcoming barriers and the entry points for collaboration, mostly I'll give an example still of where we're working in Blantyre. We've been working in different water sources, mostly point water sources, but our work on a larger catchment area that spans many communities and many districts has made it possible that we start seeking to form strong partnerships that can help us do the work even much better and help sustain the water for Blantyre City. So also the other entry point is also the need for different expertise as we're working in different perspectives that spans different sectors and different areas of expertise. So in this case, we had to look for institutions that are specializing in nature-based solutions, kind of infrastructure, and also the expertise to help us understand better on how we can do that kind of large catchment management for the water sources of Blantyre. And we're already working with Blantyre Water Board, but also mostly focusing on wash service delivery. But we thought whatever we're doing, we can't do alone. We cannot work on a catchment management for a water source that is used by another utility without engaging that utility. And because we already had that partnership, we thought we really needed to work with Blantyre Water Board. And also because Blantyre Water Board has the necessary data in terms of their sources, the demand that is there. So that naturally brought in the need to overcome the barriers that we had to see to it that we really need each other. We need Blantyre Water Board, we need TNC. And as for Water for People, also we bring on the table the strong history of our work in Blantyre. We already have existing staff that have knowledge and capacity in terms of system strengthening approach. So that helped to break the barrier, and they provided an opportunity to start working together. I can also stop there. I think that's the main example I can bring on the table. So challenges that we had seen, we took them as an opportunity to look for the people that have the relevant expertise that we needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Kay. So challenges as opportunities, and really shine a light on the kind of partnerships that are needed across sectors and with different agencies and so on to have the knowledge and capacity needed to move the work forward. Eric, I want to pass to you for your perspective on entry points as you work on the Blue Heart of Africa initiative. So over to you.
Thanks, Josh. I think for the sake of managing time, the rest of the panel members really touched on some of the issues that we are also working on as entry strategies to ensure some of these barriers that we already enumerated are addressed. Of course, key, as I indicated in my introductory comments, the push and the work within Blue Heart of Africa and WWF, especially the freshwater practice that is leading the global freshwater work within the organization, and the negotiations we've underwent almost 2 years before now arriving at signing very detailed, very focused MOUs with other WASH partners that I've already indicated. That's one of our steps moving forward, and we're really looking into now the phase of operationalizing the working frameworks around co-creating projects within the countries where we're working, looking at how do we identify policy advocacy spaces within government, within other international forums, how do we work around resource mobilization for the programs that will be co-creating. So that for us is one of the key strategies that we are looking, and we've already landed that. The last thing that I'll want to, of course, share with the audience is moving country by country. At least 1, 2, 3 countries now in Africa are moving towards having national level driven frameworks around payment for ecosystem services. An example is in Kenya, where in the period of 2015-2020, WWF Kenya supported within the Lake Naivasha Basin the establishment of a multi-stakeholder platform called Imarisha. Imarisha to improve means Kiswahili word meaning to improve, which is a government-led forum and institution driving basin restoration and protection, and addressing work with the flower farms which operate within the Lake Naivasha, working with the upstream communities in Nyandarua, so that there is clear compensation arrangements, and even promotion of our other conservation related activities, for instance, conservation agriculture, which ensures that the upstream, and even as this the water flows into the lake, there is minimal siltation, there is minimal pollution, there is minimal disposal of affluent and other waste that might affect the quality of the water. Those are some of the examples, and of course, in addition to others which have been mentioned by the other panel members. And I think it's really, we are really looking into making great strides to address the nexus between WRM and WASH.
Thanks, Eric. We are going to move next to the final round of panel comments, and then open up for the audience Q&A. We've got several already in the pipeline. Panelists, just given time, I'm going to ask you to highlight just one answer to this question very briefly, so we get to Q&A. In this question, we've talked about barriers, we've talked about entry points. We know collaboration is going to be critical across sectors to deliver the pace and scale of impact needed. So what's one key element of successful collaboration that you want to really highlight for the audience today? And I'm going to start with Basil for a quick answer here.
Okay. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, really important question. I think the one key element that I would highlight especially from SWP's experience, is that, collaboration really does take time, and it takes time to learn and adapt and its scale. And I mean, we all understand that there's real urgency to address source water protection and to bring it together with WASH. But we also need to give ourselves time to support these collaborations and learn from the challenges, successes, and failures. And so I think discussions like this, and I know others are taking place, are really important. Thanks.
Thanks, Basil. Eric, I'm going to pass to you. What's your key element of collaboration to highlight?
I think from Blue Heart of Africa's perspective, again, the emergence of our collaboration with the other WASH partners, which we are now looking at in terms of a One Health consortium within the Blue Heart of Africa. The fundamental learning is that as a catalyst, climate change, issues like rapid urbanization, be it current and future pandemics like the COVID-19, we are looking at having learned that we need integrated actions in integrated multi-sector led actions that ensures that, for instance, at a global level, we look at ensuring access to clean water being an upstream downstream relationship that can be holistically addressed through investments, through different interventions by players in a collaborative manner, even addressing at community level. What Basil talked about, the Water Resource Users Association, for WWF, we are really looking at having learned our capacity building that we've done with Water Resource Users Associations across different basins, have even enabled communities drive citizens science, citizen-led science in terms of monitoring water quality aspects, monitoring water allocation plans, and ensuring that we maintain the global standards. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Eric. Alexandra, over to you.
Sure. So very quickly, knowledge. You have to know what your rights are. You have to know what the responsibilities of the government are and other parties in order to be able to hold people accountable. And in order to participate, right? If there's a right to public consultation, in order for you to be able to collaborate with the government on these different issues, then you have to know that you have that right for public consultation. So knowledge is critical.
Thanks, Alexandra. Kate, over to you for your key element of collaboration.
Okay, yeah, so quickly also, understand your expertise and your strength and your partner's strength and expertise, and use that to bring and build a good foundation for interaction, for a successful collaboration between WASH players and conservationists. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, panelists, for all the comments here. Let's go ahead in our time now and go ahead and switch to the questions that have been coming up in the chat. So I will move through in the order that we've gotten them. The first is coming from Wesley Pereira, and it's about preventing deforestation of the upstream catchment areas and protection of the land use plans of downstream irrigation command areas and water supply betterment areas are critical for ensuring water quality. So all the, I would say, the natural infrastructure we see upstream. Many benefits that come from that. So how can we achieve these objectives, improving water quality, reducing sedimentation, preventing floods, and so on, through standard best practices, through guidelines, and through regulations? So what are some of the mechanisms that you're seeing out in the field that can address this? Who would like to answer this? Wondering, Alexandra, if you might begin just from a legal perspective on what some of the some of the ways are that you see to be able to bring these kinds of regulations or guidelines in, again, really connecting up and down of the watershed.
Sure. I mean, one way is absolutely through the use of environmental impact statements and requiring that where there is going to be construction or any kind of construction or use of the environmental area, that the impact of that has to be studied and understood. Having broader requirements for that, oftentimes it's more limited. There's very broad, and I'm blanking on the specific language, but often it's very broad in terms of what triggers the requirement for, or very narrow in terms of what triggers a requirement for an environmental impact statement, or it can be very broadly read where you can, and you can essentially say, well, I don't fall under this category. So it's important that those environmental impact statements are required and that create those protective zones upstream. Again, it's drawing those connections. It's even just starting from the place where you already are, but others aren't necessarily, of knowing that those upstream locations, those upstream forest locations are critical to protecting the availability and the quality of that source water. So I would say knowledge just in just that basic area, but then creating the law. Like, so for example, it's in terms of like protecting the source water quality, it's not just about creating water quality standards and effluent limitations. That's a huge part of it, but it's also creating those laws and saying, okay, well, if these protect it, how do we protect these key areas, right? What laws do we need to put in place in order to protect those forests and those grounds that are around those source areas? Even, and not just in terms of the forest, but just like riparian boundaries for agriculture. That's a great example, right? Requiring that there be some kind of 50 to 100 meter distance between the end of a farm or the end of an agricultural area and a source water is critical to ensuring that fertilizer doesn't run into that water. And requiring that through the law means that it has to be done. It isn't a question, it isn't a guideline, it isn't stuck in a policy or a strategy. It's required under law, and there will be penalties. Right, that's also somebody, I think it was Basil, who talked about the practice, right? If the law isn't practiced, it's meaningless. So you have to have that penalty behind it. There has to be a repercussion, and usually it's financial. So there has to be a penalty behind it that holds that person accountable to abiding by that.
Thanks, Alexandra. I may actually use that as a bridge to the next question, which is also directed towards you. It asks about what kind of how the law or legal frameworks can help with accountability, trust, transparency. You've already just now touched on the accountability side and the critical role of that. What's your perspective on how you bring in, can legal frameworks be effective for building trust, and how do you set things up to be as transparent as possible? Any thoughts on that? The question is in the context of Kenya, but welcome comments more broadly as well.
Sure. So thank you for your question. Great question. I think broadly, the law itself, I think, creates that foundation for trust, right? The rule of law writ large actually is establishing that relationship between government and the people. I think we forget sometimes that the government exists to represent our interests. And I think politics and all the divisions that we have, mean that we forget that. And so, but the rule of law creates that relationship between the government and people. And so the law is actually the memorialization of that. It's the written form of what that commitment the government is making to the people and the people are making to the government. I think when you get into that relationship between the national and local government, especially in Kenya, one of the greatest challenges that I think Kenya has faced is in this massive devolution down to the local level. And this to me is one of the I think this is a challenge in the wash sector in particular, that there's this huge focus on localization and devolution, but to the detriment of realizing that there are things that should be at the national level. There are standards and practices that should be set at the national level, water quality standards, effluent limitations. There's nothing wrong with setting that, right? But you can empower local institutions, and you can take off some of the burden by creating those national level standards, right? You can still give them the authority to implement, but then you also have to create a mechanism of accountability, right? That local government still has to be accountable to the national government. So that might be through reporting mechanisms. So WASREB, it is required in the law, and I was actually just taking a look, it's required to create a monitoring and information system. The law says that, but the law provides no guidance in terms of what that monitoring and information system looks like. Right. And without that, you don't really know what you should expect. It just says create this system. Well, that system is an infinite number of possibilities, rather than saying this is what we expect for you to be reporting back to us. This is what is going to be publicly available. This is information we need to know. So people know the quality of their drinking water. They know the quality of the water resources that they're swimming in or fishing in, or even getting drinking water resources for, or water for their agriculture, for their cows and their other livestock. That information is critical. So, I think that relationship also between the national and local level is really challenging to manage. And we want desperately to devolve that. That's a real sector priority. But I think it's been to the detriment. I think we need to think more holistically about what are those channels of communication, and what are those relationships between those institutions. And the law sets those relationships up. So.
Thanks, Alexandra. That's some really important points for the audience to think about, and I think bringing that legal perspective. I want to move. We have just under 2 minutes left in the call. There's a couple of audience Q&A questions. We'll do our best as a panel to respond to those directly through the Pathable site. But I do want to give the panelists in this last minute a chance to briefly state your call to action. We have a lot to build on. We also have much work ahead of us to close the gap on SDG 6 and to build a more resilient future for water. I want each of you to highlight what you see as a critical call to action for this community. Eric, I'm going to start with you for your call to action. Again, briefly.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you. And very briefly, I think from all this around collaboration and ensuring that nexus is the gap in that nexus is neat. Our call to action is that wash and freshwater conservation stakeholders, be they government, ministries, communities, and other organizations, private sector, civil society, need to partner and collaborate more effectively to maximize the synergies that we really are looking at. This, by extension, we are looking at ensuring that wash must be elevated and integrated within conservation, and conservation must elevate wash to become the norm in collaborating across different borders and frontiers. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Alexandra, over to you.
First and foremost, water security has to be a government priority. It has to be number one. It is always number two. It has to be number one in every single country. I don't care where you are, it has to be number one. That is the call to action. That's all I have to say. Your legal institutions should support that, but you need to prioritize water. So if you're not talking about water, then there's a problem.
Thanks, Alexandra. Basil, over to you.
Thanks, Josh. I think we need to take a broader approach to investments. We need to expand our focus from infrastructure to the whole freshwater ecosystem to ensure the sustainability of our wash services. Obviously, gray infrastructure will continue to be important, but investments in green infrastructure and source water protection measures can increase the reliability of the water that we depend on and improve the long-term service delivery, the sustainability of service delivery, and reducing operation costs. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Basil. Kate, the last word for you, and then we'll wrap.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks, everyone. So our call to action is that the wash sector and the conservation sector have waited for too long to collaborate to make real change. At this urgent moment in time, as climate crisis accelerates, we all must act to ensure access to high quality wash services over time and to ensure continued access to world's most valuable resource, which is water, is available. So thank you so much. Let's act now, not tomorrow, now. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks to the entire panel. These are urgent issues, and I'm grateful for the chance to learn from these panelists today. Big thank you to the audience for joining, and I wish everyone a good rest of your World Water Week. With that, we'll go ahead and end the session. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.